Napoleon Bonaparte conquered more territory than any European leader since the Roman emperors. He defeated every army sent against him. He redrew the map of Europe with his sword, and yet he lost. Not to a general, not to a coalition, but to a system he never understood and refused to use. This is not a story about battles. This is a story about money, about how the most brilliant military mind of his age was destroyed by bankers who never fired a single shot, about how Britain, a small island nation, outspent the greatest empire in Europe, and about the financial weapon that has shaped every major war since. This is The Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. To understand how Napoleon lost, you need to understand what made Britain different. In 1794, France was at war with most of Europe. The revolution had executed the king, terrified the monarchies, and unleashed armies driven by ideology rather than loyalty. France should have been crushed. It was surrounded by enemies. Its treasury was empty. Its currency was collapsing. But France had something its enemies lacked: mass conscription. The levy en masse mobilized over 1 million men. For the first time in modern history, an entire nation went to war. Not mercenaries, not professional soldiers, citizens fighting for their republic. The old European armies, small and expensive, couldn't compete with this flood of manpower. France won battle after battle, and when Napoleon took command, the victories became legendary. Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, names that still echo in military academies around the world. By 1810, Napoleon controlled an empire stretching from Spain to Poland. He had defeated Austria 5 times, Prussia twice. Russia had signed a humiliating peace. Only Britain remained defiant. A tiny island, a small army, no land border with France, and yet Britain would win. Here's what Napoleon never grasped. Wars are not won by armies alone. They are won by the ability to pay for armies, to replace losses, to fund coalitions, to outlast your enemy. And Britain had perfected a financial system that could do exactly that. The secret was the Bank of England. Founded in 1694, the Bank of England was created for one purpose: to lend money to the government. Before the bank, kings borrowed from merchants, from foreign bankers, from anyone who would lend. Each loan was a separate negotiation. Interest rates were high, terms were unfavorable, and when kings couldn't pay, they defaulted, destroying their credit for generations. The Bank of England changed everything. It created a permanent institution that could lend to the government at reasonable rates. It issued banknotes that circulated as money. It managed the national debt, turning short-term emergencies into long-term obligations that could be rolled over indefinitely. Think about what this meant. Britain could borrow money not just for one war, but forever. Each generation inherited the debts of the last and passed new debts to the next. The debt never had to be repaid in full. It just had to be serviced. As long as Britain could pay the interest, it could borrow more. By 1800, Britain's national debt was over £400 million, an astronomical sum. More than twice the annual economic output of the entire country. By any normal measure, Britain should have been bankrupt. But Britain wasn't bankrupt, because the debt wasn't a burden. It was a weapon. Every year, Britain paid around £20 million in interest. That money went to bondholders, merchants, bankers, aristocrats, ordinary citizens who had invested in government securities. They had a direct financial stake in British victory. If Britain lost the war, if the government collapsed, their investments would be worthless. The national debt turned the British elite into shareholders of the state. They didn't just support the war for patriotic reasons. They supported it because their money was on the line. And here's the genius. Because so many people owned government bonds, the government could always sell more. There was always demand. Interest rates stayed low. Britain could borrow at 3 or 4%, while other nations paid 8 or 10. Cheap credit was Britain's superweapon. It meant they could afford more ships, more guns, more subsidies to allies. It meant they could lose battles and keep fighting. It meant they could fund coalition after coalition until one of them finally worked. Napoleon understood none of this. Napoleon was a military genius, but his economic thinking was rooted in the 18th century. He believed in hard money, gold and silver, tangible wealth that could be counted and controlled. He despised paper money and the bankers who created it. This wasn't irrational. Napoleon had seen what happened to France's revolutionary currency. The Assignats, paper money backed by confiscated church lands, had collapsed into worthlessness. By 1796, it took over 300 paper livres to buy what one gold livre could purchase. The trauma of hyperinflation shaped Napoleon's entire financial philosophy. When Napoleon came to power, he created the Bank of France in 1800, but he deliberately limited its power. Unlike the Bank of England, which could lend freely to the government, the Bank of France was restricted. Napoleon insisted on maintaining gold reserves. He distrusted credit. He wanted money he could see and touch. The result was a fundamental asymmetry. Britain could create money through debt. France could only spend what it had. Britain fought with borrowed wealth from the future. Napoleon fought with the gold in his treasury. In the short term, this seemed wise. Napoleon's finances were solid. He didn't accumulate crushing debts. His currency held its value. But in a long war, it was fatal. Because Napoleon could only spend what he had, he needed quick victories. He needed to defeat enemies fast, impose indemnities, and move on before the costs accumulated. This is why his campaigns were so aggressive, so decisive, so brilliantly rapid. He couldn't afford anything else. But Britain didn't need quick victories. Britain could wait, could fund allies, could lose battles and raise new armies, could blockade French ports for years. Time was on Britain's side because Britain could borrow time. Napoleon tried to break Britain through economic warfare. His continental system, declared in 1806, prohibited all European trade with Britain. If he couldn't invade the island, he would strangle its economy. On paper, it was brilliant. Britain depended on trade. Cut off its markets, and its economy would collapse. Its merchants would riot. Its government would sue for peace. But the continental system failed. Not because the idea was wrong, but because Napoleon couldn't afford to enforce it properly. Smuggling flourished across Europe. British goods entered through neutral ports, through corrupt officials, through thousands of small violations that Napoleon couldn't stop without an army of customs agents he couldn't pay for. And the attempt to enforce the system led Napoleon into disasters. He invaded Portugal to close its ports. That dragged him into Spain, where a guerrilla war bled his armies for 6 years. He demanded Russia enforce the blockade. When the Tsar refused, Napoleon invaded with 600,000 men, the greatest army ever assembled. It was destroyed. Each attempt to seal the continent cost more than Napoleon could afford, and each failure made Britain's position stronger. Now let's talk about the bankers who really won the war, the Rothschilds. Today the name is synonymous with banking dynasties and conspiracy theories, but in 1815 they were something simpler, the most efficient financial network in Europe. Mayer Amschel Rothschild started as a coin dealer in Frankfurt. He had 5 sons, and he sent each one to a different European city. Nathan to London, James to Paris, Salomon to Vienna, Karl to Naples. Amschel stayed in Frankfurt. 5 brothers in 5 financial capitals, connected by blood, by trust, and by courier networks faster than any governments. During the Napoleonic Wars, the Rothschilds became indispensable to Britain. Nathan Rothschild in London handled a problem that had plagued British strategy for years. How do you pay armies fighting on the continent? British troops in Spain needed gold, but shipping gold across the Bay of Biscay, past French privateers, was dangerous and expensive. Nathan Rothschild solved this through a web of bills of exchange, money transfers, currency conversions that move value without moving metal. He bought gold in Portugal, where it was cheap, sold British goods on the continent through networks of smugglers, converted currencies through his brother's banks in ways that baffled French authorities. The gold that paid Wellington's army often traveled through Paris itself, right under Napoleon's nose. Between 1811 and 1815, Nathan Rothschild handled over £40 million in British government transfers. That's roughly equivalent to several $billion today. He took a commission on every transaction. But more importantly, he proved that private banking networks could do what governments couldn't. The Rothschilds weren't loyal to any nation. They were loyal to profit and to each other. They financed Austrian armies and French Reconstruction. They didn't care who won, as long as someone was borrowing. But in the Napoleonic Wars, their networks served British interests because Britain had the credit to pay them. But the Rothschilds were just the most famous part of a larger system. Britain's real weapon was something even more powerful: subsidies. Between 1793 and 1815, Britain paid over £65 million in direct subsidies to its continental allies. That's more than the entire annual budget of most European nations. Austria received subsidies. Prussia received subsidies. Russia received subsidies. Even minor German states received British gold to keep their armies in the field against Napoleon. Think about what this meant strategically. Napoleon could defeat an Austrian army, and 6 months later, Austria would be back with a new army, paid for by British loans. He could crush Prussia, and Prussia would rebuild with British money. He could force Russia to sign a peace treaty, and within years Russia would rejoin the coalition, its armies equipped with British-funded weapons. Napoleon was playing whack-a-mole against enemies who kept respawning because someone else was paying their bills. This is the hidden economics of the Napoleonic Wars. Every coalition Napoleon defeated was replaced by another. The first coalition, the second coalition, the third coalition, the fourth coalition, the fifth coalition, the sixth coalition, 7 coalitions in 20 years. And Britain financed them all. No other nation could have done this. Austria was perpetually broke. Prussia was too small. Russia was too poor and too far from European credit markets. Only Britain had the financial infrastructure to borrow indefinitely and distribute that borrowed money across the continent. Napoleon knew he was being outspent, and he tried to fight back with his own financial warfare. Here's a story that most history books don't tell. In 1810, Napoleon authorized the largest counterfeiting operation in history. French printers produced millions of fake British banknotes, Austrian bonds, and Russian rubles. The plan was to flood enemy economies with worthless paper, destroying confidence in their currencies. It was clever, it was ruthless, and it failed. The counterfeits were good, but not good enough. British bankers could detect the fakes. More importantly, the volume Napoleon could produce was tiny compared to the actual money supply. He was trying to destabilize an economy with a printing press, while Britain was creating money through an entire financial system. Napoleon also tried to weaponize silver. He hoarded precious metals, hoping to drain them from British circulation. At one point, he had accumulated over 400 million francs in gold and silver in the cellars of the Tuileries Palace. A fortune by any measure. But it sat there, dead money, while Britain's credit system created billions in purchasing power from thin air. The contrast was stark. Napoleon stockpiled treasure like a medieval king. Britain spent money it didn't have like a modern government. One approach was conservative and tangible. The other was radical and abstract. And the radical approach won. There's another dimension to this financial war that deserves attention: the British blockade. From 1803 onward, the Royal Navy blockaded French ports. This wasn't just about preventing invasion. It was about strangling French trade, cutting off customs revenue, and forcing Napoleon to spend more and more on the continental system while earning less and less from it. The numbers tell the story. Before the wars, French overseas trade was worth over 500 million francs annually. By 1812, it had collapsed to less than 60 million. France lost access to colonial sugar, coffee, and cotton. Industries that depended on imports withered. Tax revenues from trade disappeared. Meanwhile, Britain's trade actually increased during the wars. British merchants found new markets in South America, in the Ottoman Empire, in any port that would defy Napoleon's blockade. The more Napoleon tried to close Europe, the more Britain opened the rest of the world. This is the brutal mathematics of financial warfare. Britain could survive without European trade. France could not survive without the wealth that trade generated. The blockade was slowly bankrupting Napoleon, while British debt kept compounding into power. By 1812, Napoleon was desperate. The continental system was leaking everywhere. His treasury was draining. His armies were overextended across Spain, across Germany, across a dozen occupied territories that cost more to hold than they produced. The invasion of Russia was not just ideological madness, it was economic necessity. Napoleon needed a decisive victory that would force the continent back into compliance, generate plunder to refill his treasury, and end the endless drain of guerrilla wars and occupation costs. Instead, he lost everything. 600,000 men marched into Russia. Fewer than 100,000 returned, the greatest army in European history, destroyed not by battle, but by distance, weather, and the simple fact that Napoleon couldn't afford to supply it properly. And then came Waterloo. June 18, 1815. Napoleon had escaped from Elba, raised a new army, and marched into Belgium. The coalition arrayed against him included British, Prussian, Dutch, and Belgian forces. The fate of Europe would be decided in a single day. The legend says that Nathan Rothschild learned the outcome of Waterloo before anyone else in London. His couriers, faster than government dispatches, brought word that Napoleon had been defeated. And according to the myth, Rothschild used this information to make a fortune on the stock exchange. The story has been exaggerated over 2 centuries. Some versions claim he deliberately spread false rumors of French victory, crashed the market, bought everything cheap, then revealed the truth and sold at enormous profit. The reality is more mundane, but still remarkable. Rothschild did learn the news early. He did trade on it. He did make money. But the fortunes he built came from years of government contracts, not one day of speculation. What matters is what the story reveals about the new world Napoleon's defeat created. A world where information moved faster than armies, where bankers knew outcomes before kings, where financial networks spanned borders that soldiers died to defend. Napoleon was fighting the last war of the old world. He thought victory came from battles, from territory, from the genius of commanders. He didn't understand that the future belonged to those who controlled credit, information, and the invisible flows of money that made armies possible. After Waterloo, the Rothschilds became the most powerful bankers in Europe. They financed the restoration of monarchies, the suppression of revolutions, the building of railroads. Governments that once commanded them now came to them as supplicants, begging for loans. The world Napoleon lost to was not a world of kings and generals. It was a world of bonds and interest rates, of central banks and national debts, of financial systems that could mobilize wealth across generations. And here's the uncomfortable truth. That world is still our world. Every modern war is financed the same way Britain financed its fight against Napoleon. Governments borrow money they can never fully repay. Central banks manage the debt. Citizens become creditors of the state. The costs are spread across decades, hidden in inflation, passed to children not yet born. The American Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, the War on Terror, all of them funded by the same basic mechanism that defeated Napoleon, the ability to borrow against the future. Think about what this means for you today. Your government's debt is not a mistake, it's a feature. The ability to borrow is the ability to project power. Nations that cannot borrow cannot fight long wars, cannot sustain themselves through crises, cannot compete with those who can. But this power comes with costs. Every dollar borrowed must be serviced. Interest payments consume budgets. And when debts grow too large, when confidence breaks, the system that enables power becomes the instrument of collapse. Napoleon refused to build such a system because he saw its dangers. He saw how debt could enslave nations to creditors, how paper money could become worthless overnight, how financial power could escape the control of governments. He was right about the dangers. He was wrong to think he could win without accepting them. The lesson is not that debt is good or bad. The lesson is that debt is power. Those who master it rule the world. Those who reject it are conquered by those who don't. Notice the pattern. It appears in every era, in every empire, in every conflict between old power and new. The Spanish Empire had all the gold of the Americas and still went bankrupt because it couldn't manage credit. The Dutch Republic, tiny and resource poor, became a global power because it invented modern finance. Britain, an island with no natural advantages, defeated the greatest land empire in Europe because it could borrow more cheaply than anyone else. Today, the United States maintains its global position not primarily through military strength, but through financial dominance. The dollar is the world's reserve currency. American debt is the safest asset on Earth. This financial power projects force more effectively than any aircraft carrier. China understands this. Its rise is not just about manufacturing or technology. It's about building financial systems that can challenge American dominance. The Belt and Road Initiative is not charity, it's debt diplomacy, making nations dependent on Chinese credit the way European nations once depended on British loans. The wars of the future will be fought the same way the wars of the past were fought, not just with weapons, but with currencies, with debt, with the ability to create money from nothing and convince the world it has value. So, what should you take from this story? First, understand that military power is financial power. Armies march on money. The nation that can fund the longest war usually wins it. This was true in 1815. It's true today. Second, recognize that debt is not weakness. Used wisely, it's the ultimate force multiplier. The ability to spend resources you don't yet have, to borrow from the future, to turn confidence into power. Napoleon's refusal to master this weapon cost him everything. Third, remember that financial systems outlast the wars that create them. The Bank of England was founded to fight France. It still exists. The national debt mechanism that defeated Napoleon now finances modern welfare states. The Rothschild banking model shaped global finance for 2 centuries. And fourth, know that the real battles are invisible. Napoleon could see enemy armies. He could count their cannons and cavalry, but he couldn't see the flows of credit that paid for them, the bills of exchange that moved gold across borders, the bond markets that turned British confidence into French defeat. The same invisible battles continue today. Currency wars, trade wars, debt crises. These shape the world more than any military conflict, and most people never see them happening. Napoleon died in exile on St. Helena in 1821, alone, sick, dictating memoirs that blamed everyone but himself for his failures. He never understood what had really defeated him. He thought he lost to winter in Russia, to treachery in France, to luck at Waterloo. He never grasped that he lost to a financial system he refused to build, to bankers he despised, to the invisible power of money that could be created from nothing but trust. The greatest general of his age was defeated by accountants. The most powerful empire in Europe was broken by interest rates, and the world that emerged from his defeat was a world where money mattered more than armies, where credit mattered more than courage, where the real power lay not in palaces or battlefields, but in the ledgers of bankers who never heard a shot fired in anger. That world is your world. The same forces that destroyed Napoleon shape your life today. The same invisible flows of money determine which nations rise and which fall. The same basic question remains. Who controls the debt controls the future. History doesn't repeat exactly, but if you ignore it, it will crush you just the same. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.